The Toy Mill by David Nickle and Karl Schroeder. Read by David Nickle. Chapter 1. Emily Gets Her Wish. The man in the moon's smile began to slip. It turned into a leer. Then, breaking from the rim of the moon, came a shape of crystalline hardness, led by 8 bobbing points. Emily, perched straddling the peak of her auntie's house, with the cold shivering through her spine, counted those points 3 times, and whispered aloud, "Comet, Cupid, Donner, Vixen." She mouthed the rest of the verse to hide that she didn't remember the other names. The procession cut behind a black smear of cloud, and Emily scrambled higher on the roof, her back pressed against the frozen brick of the chimney. The winter air made a frost in her throat, and she clutched her pink parka over her chest. The sleigh was gone. She'd missed it, if it ever had been there. Emily turned away, filled with a deep and despairing sense of abandonment. The moon turned darker. Iron runners hissed past, inches above her head, and a breath of stratospheric cold made her shiver. For a moment, all that she could see was the swollen underbelly of the sleigh, like the black bottom of a cauldron. Then the thing was landing with unctuous delicacy on the virgin snow of the roof. The ski tracks began near enough to Emily that she could touch them, and that is what she did, even though they steamed with a black substance like the burnt drippings from an overcooked roast. The tracks were wider than her hand, and packed down so hard as to make the snow into a sheet of perfect, polished ice. At the end of those tracks, great iron skis whose ends spiraled 4 times glowed with tiny red embers from treetops brushed too closely, and creaked around the thick rivets that held the sleigh together. She couldn't see the reindeer for the bulk of the sleigh, but Emily could clearly see her own tracks through the deep wet snow of the roof. They were the only disturbance in its blued perfection, other than the tracks of the sleigh. She forced herself to stand up, and cautiously sidled around the edge of the sleigh. The roof was steep here, and she wanted to hold the sleigh for support, but she was afraid to touch it. Her heart in her mouth, she peered up the steep side of the monstrous car and said, "Santa?" For a moment nothing happened. Then a creaking sound like frozen leather, and a hand whiter than the moon appeared to clutch the rail of the sleigh. It seemed as though the entire rooftop swayed, but it was only a shifting of runners on the sharp-peaked roof. The fingers, long and dexterous as only a toy maker's can be, bent back at the 3rd joint with the effort of movement. Santa Claus grew over the rail like a thunderhead over mountain-tops. His hair was whiter than his flesh. Thick whorls of ice embedded his beard in icicles like a January cataract. More separated the thick hairs of his eyebrows into individual daggers, pushed back by the Yuletide winds of the stratosphere, so that they swept down to meet at the bridge of his narrow, blue-tinged nose. Wisps of pale hair scattered from beneath his red cap, over his small pink ears. His eyes were tiny too, pink-rimmed and black at their iris, and looking, searching the eaves troughs, the darkened windows, the empty playground 3 streets down, questing hungrily and never blinking once, in an endless quest for girls and boys. "Ahem," said Emily in her politest voice. Santa's little eyes narrowed even more, but still he didn't see her. He leaned out a long way from the sleigh, his breath coming in slow, steady rasps, like a dry bellows. Finally, Emily screwed up her courage and reached up to pluck his sleeve. He jerked back like a puppet, and his eyes widened impossibly as he saw her. For a second she thought that he was angry, then maybe no, he was scared. But breaking past all those things came a kind of smile. It sent the icicles around his mouth into a macabre dance. "Ooh," he said at last, "a child." His voice was a high tenor with breathy overtones. Emily could not see how such a vast and disordered bulk could produce a voice like that. "Hello," she said. "Well," he raised a trembling hand to clink the strands of his beard. "Well, indeed. Yes, hello, little thing. You are a little thing, aren't you?" "Santa?" she said with all her 8 years of determination. "I want to be an elf." He didn't answer, he just stared at her. A wind curled up from the street below, sending a twist of cutting snow into Emily's eyes. A tiny part of her was crying, the same part that cried when she was 6, when her parents went away, and Auntie told her that she could have the room with the grandfather clock that had stopped. "I want to be an elf, Santa," she repeated, and stomped her foot on the frozen rooftop. "Please!" There was another shudder from inside the sleigh, and Santa gave a lurch and rose 5 more feet over the house of Emily's aunt. He gripped the sleigh rim with a white-knuckled fist. In his other hand he held a box, wrapped in blue shiny paper with a ribbon so red that it could only have been spun by elves. Santa Claus lifted that arm high, and suddenly bent at his waist so that his face was inches from Emily's. Ice crumbled in crystalline avalanches as his smile widened and his narrow tongue darted across his blue, thin lips. "A child," he breathed, sending a frosty wind at Emily that made her blink. "Yes, a good child, a child who is never naughty, never bad. Only one thing for this child." Santa pulled away from Emily, and his great head whipped toward the front of the sleigh to an unseen reindeer. "Isn't that right, Rudolph?" he shrieked. Emily clapped her hands over her ears and nearly lost her balance. And then, as fast as the echoes of Santa's cackling cheer died in the neighborhood, the shiny wrapped box was trembling before Emily. Santa's right hand gripped it carefully so as not to damage the wrappings. His face hovered 5 inches behind it, and his tiny black eyes watched her with wide anticipation. The icebound eyebrows twinkled invitingly. The box, Emily saw, was doll-sized. "No," she said firmly, and repeated her request slowly, in case Santa were hard of hearing. "I want to be an elf. Please." He looked puzzled. Then he drew the present back, and with hurried, savage movements tore the box up. He dangled a limp doll in her face, eyeing her with fixed concern over the back of his hand. Emily shook her whole head, and her upper body, too, for good measure. "Doesn't want the dolly," muttered Santa through an uncomprehending frown. "Don't want the dolly?" He tugged at his beard. Then, with a quick, decisive movement, he stuffed the doll into a fold of his greatcoat. Where?" He turned and scrabbled about in the back of the sleigh. "Aha! Here." He brought out an ornate snuff-box and opened it. Taking out a pinch of powder, he tossed it at Emily. Golden, shimmering dust settled about her with a sound like tinkling chimes. "There. Salakaboom! You're an elf now." He turned away and grabbed the reins. Then he looked back. Tears rolled down Emily's cheeks. She looked up at him resentfully. "What?" he said, taken aback. "I said I want to be an elf. I want to go to the North Pole and make toys and sing with the other elves and see the reindeer and Rudolph and his nose and all the toys and be Christmas all year round," she wailed, and then she was past words. "You want to be my elf?" Santa stroked his beard, and a thoughtful glint appeared in the outside corner of his left eye. Santa's uncertain lips twitched back into a smile. "Make toys? Go away," he sniggered wetly through his nose. "Go away with Santa?" Emily thought of her auntie and her room with the silent clock that loomed all night long, and about long division and detentions. "I want to be an elf," she repeated. "All right, then," he bellowed, and reaching down with a long, branch-like arm, hoiked her over his lap and into the seat beside him. Emily fought to right herself as he drew up the reins and flipped them mightily. "Go on!" he screamed. She heard the sound of tiny hooves scrambling in the deep snow. Emily righted herself in time to see 8 impossibly tiny reindeer, hauling with all their might, fall in pairs off the edge of the roof. With a crunch of iron against ice, the sleigh fell. Emily screamed as the ground rushed up. Then they were plummeting, not down, but sideways between the tall houses. They continued to fall higher and higher into the sky.